Hello, very beautiful community. Let's talk about the election result in Georgia briefly. It's a very difficult situation for that country because it's facing a challenge of being in Russia's sphere of influence without an easy solution to it, right? It's trying to reach for political belonging with the West without a clear path to that, and while the West is itself in global political retreat. So it's like trying to, cross a river without the materials to build a boat or a bridge, while the bank of the river is widening because the West is in global retreat. So to honor my last conversation on the main channel with Mark Galeotti, which, by the way, you must see if you haven't, because it really embodies a lot of the spirit of the way we're having this conversation. I mean, not this conversation, but all our conversations. There's a single ongoing conversation. And the main channel is in some strife, possibly because in part it's been a victim of an invalid traffic bug that I can't do anything about. So the Galeotti video got not sort of the 100,000+ views that's typical, but 20. But it's one of the best videos on the main channel if you have the openness to sit through a half-an-hour conversation, which is a conversation about talking, right? How do experts responsibly cover the Ukraine war and talk about politics with you? So in the spirit of that conversation, it's very important to say that I am not remotely a regional expert, right? I haven't been to Georgia since I spent a month there as a child in 1990 learning Hebrew in the mountains. And my relationship with Georgia is the relationship of a Western middle-class person, mainly mediated by cuisine. Georgian cuisine is really the only cuisine from the ex-Soviet area with which I have an emotional bond. It does trump all the other cuisines in the ex-Soviet space. Ukraine. And of course, it is also a spiritual home for amphora skin contact artisanal winemaking. And even if the best wines of that kind are made in Friuli, everyone who works there knows that the spiritual home of the work they do is in Georgia. So it's an extraordinary cultural legacy. But I'm saying this to trivialize my own expertise in relation to Georgia. So what I'll do is comment a bit on generic political challenges and also Russian influence. Now, the last couple of times you may have heard much about Georgia is when repressive laws were being passed, whether it's the foreign agents law, the LGBT law. And of course, it's inevitable that we're talking about it again today. OSCE noted reports of intimidation, coercion, pressure on voters in the election, but stopped short of saying the election had been stolen or falsified. European response was slow, but Viktor Orban was one of the first to congratulate the Georgian dream with victory. Exit polls by international organizations were pointing to a 42% outcome for Georgian dream, but we ended up with 54%, something like that. And that's certainly an indication of falsifications, even if there is no proof of that I'm aware of as I speak with you. Proof of mass falsifications. Opposition reactions. Tina Bakhachava, one of the leaders of the opposition, says the Unity National Movement does not accept these falsified election results. We have consulted with other oppositional parties who crossed the 5% threshold, and we hope and believe that the opposition will unify in rejecting these falsified results. This is not an attempt to steal voters from a particular party. It's an attempt to steal Georgia's European future. Now, President Zurabishvili, as I tape this, I think has just spoken and called the elections falsified. And she is informally the leader of Georgia's opposition, really, at least in powerful symbolic terms. I don't recognize these elections because recognizing these elections means recognizing the Russian takeover of Georgia, the subordination of Georgia to Russia. It was a special Russian operation and Russian elections, a new level of hybrid warfare. We've been deprived of our constitutional right to elections, and the very concept of elections is now void, because if nothing changes, it's hard to imagine at all what kind of elections there might be in this country. Going on then to invite Western partners to be clear and not to side with the illegitimate government, but with the people of Georgia. So a question now arises about what strategy the opposition might have. Because gathering en masse in public squares has great political significance, but it's not in itself a political strategy, right? That's not going to get the Georgia Dream folks to say, oops, we concede the point. So how far do you go on participating in institutions with compromised legitimacy is always a very important question. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. Does the opposition have an effective strategy in response? And is there an effective strategy available to them at all? And so here we run into the risk of expressive versus effective politics, right? Because simply protesting till 2028 isn't going to solve the problem. And here I can only make a generic point in my capacity as a political philosopher. And that is that I am a big fan of pro-democratic street politics. But it's incredibly important, and I'm really saying this generically, I'm not talking about Georgia because I'm not a country expert, but it's incredibly important to not prematurely withdraw from intra-institutional conflict and recede into street politics, even if the institutional conflict is compromised, even if the game's rigged against you. So it's very important that much of the time the maxim applies that so long as there is some degree of institutional pluralism, no matter how much the game is set up against you, you compete. And here I am somebody who, in the context of Russian history, at least in part accepts the critique of the Russian opposition by the late Gleb Pavlovsky, who used to be an architect of the Putin regime and then an opponent of the Putin regime, that the Russian opposition exited inter-institutional conflict politics and took to the streets prematurely. Now, just a historical point. The imperial dynamic between Russia and Georgia is more straightforward than the imperial dynamic between Russia and Ukraine, partly because Russia is not for a moment claiming that Ukrainians are that Georgians are an us who have forgotten their us, as they're claiming with Ukrainians, and because Georgia is less interpenetrated with the projection and elaboration of the Russian Empire than Ukraine was. So some of the generic systemic challenges here that you also see in many other countries is that it's easier for pro-democratic political forces to monitor democratic process, how elections go in urban centers, than it is in the provinces. And it's easy for an authoritarian-leaning government to line up and control folks in the provinces than it is to control folks who are urban. There is a social class in Georgia that is, for its prosperity and security, interested in the maintenance of strong links with Russia. what you shouldn't conclude from that is that everybody, even in that class, is in love with Russia. They're not. There's much space for pragmatic, resentful dependence. Economic dependence on Russia is a natural default for Georgia without easy alternatives. And so the question arises about actionable alternatives, right, to being in Russia's orbit. And you can't be in Russia's economic orbit without being politically compromised by Russia. And all of this is made much, 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 much harder by the fact that the West is in retreat. By the fact that the West, number one, stood up to Putin, but not so strongly when he invaded Ukraine over the last two and a half years. And that the West's regional presence is not very strong, right? So it's very hard to move westwards when it is a politically deglobalizing West, when it is the West that's in retreat. So that's very, very difficult. So it's not a pretty story. It's really not a pretty story. And it's not clear to me how that story gets prettier, I'm afraid. The country is in a precarious balance. And it's important that all the oppositional forces are as politically and not just expressively proactive as possible, right? Which is almost like saying nothing at all. So that's all I've got. Lots and lots of love.